There are stories buried in the hills of West Virginia, secrets whispered by the trees and carried along the cold, persistent wind. Legends fade, memories rot, but some tales refuse to die. This one begins in 1894, a year when faith could be twisted by hunger, when sin was not just a word in the mouth of a preacher, but a poison in the soul of an entire town. If you listen closely, perhaps you'll hear the boots on gravel roads, the strained hymns from the clapboard church, the churning of the creek after a storm. Or maybe, if you're quiet, the ghost of Abel Grant himself will stand behind you, hands folded, voice trembling with the words that damned them all. Willow Creek in the spring of 1894 was a place made of wood and hope. Its fields stretched toward the sky, golden and patchy, while the mountains stood distant and watchful, wreathed in mist. The people were mostly miners and farmers, souls ground down by work and loss, clinging to faith as their only guarantee. Their children ran barefoot over cobblestones, their women hung washing between peeling fence posts, and their men gathered at dusk around burn barrels, trading news and warnings. The center of their world was the church, whitewashed, haphazardly built, its steeple leaning like an exhausted man. But what it promised was certainty. Once each week at sunrise, the entire town would shuffle inside to listen to Reverend Abel Grant. He was not a man of warmth, nor of comfort. His sermons tore at the heart, carved out the worst thoughts, exposed sin as if it were a living creature lurking beneath each rib. Yet Grant was respected, almost feared, his voice filling the pews even when hope outside those doors was running thin. No one could have guessed what was coming. Not the boy fishing in the swell of the creek, swinging his feet in the morning. Not the old widow watching her husband's grave collect mountain snow. Not even Job Carter, the miner who had lost 3 sons to the shaft. As spring ripened into summer, something subtle had begun to change in the air around Willow Creek. It started with murmurs, hardly more than the usual complaints that gnawed through every community. Bread was harder to come by, moonshine tasted bitter, animals died and were buried with little said. Then a woman lost her wedding ring and accused her neighbor of theft. A child was caught lying, and her father delivered her to Grant's doorstep asking for penance. Small frictions, nothing more, but they built like floodwaters behind a dam. Reverend Abel Grant watched all of this with intense, silent interest. He was a man of edges, sharp nose, grim mouth, eyes pale and relentless as the sky just before dawn. He did not smile. He rarely left the parsonage except to preach or counsel those who strayed. All throughout May he spoke of sin in the heart, sin in the mind, sin that crept through the town like a sickness unseen but deadly. Each Sunday his sermons thundered higher, his eyes burning into each face, until even the most pious felt suddenly naked and ashamed. Grant's own story was a mystery, one made even darker by his reluctance to speak of the past. Some said he'd come from the coalfields near Charleston after a tragedy. Others murmured about a wife and children left behind or buried. All anyone truly knew was that he arrived unannounced late one autumn night, following the funeral of the old preacher. The parsonage lights burned well past midnight that night, and when dawn came, Grant was still praying, his voice ragged but unbroken. June brought storms, violent, hammering down on the roofs, churning the creek into a bruised ribbon through the brush. Whole crops were washed away, a barn struck by lightning and left to smolder. The people of Willow Creek bowed their heads and prayed for mercy, but the preacher offered no comfort. Instead, Grant's sermons grew more severe. He called for fasting, for repentance, for confession in front of the entire flock. That was when the fear truly began. It was not a loud, open terror, the sort that leads to locked doors or angry mobs, but a creeping dread. The people found themselves glancing over their shoulders in the hush of twilight, second-guessing their neighbors' smiles, testing the weight of their own secrets. The church, once a sanctuary, now stood as an accusation at the center of town. One Sunday in late June, Grant called a young couple, Samuel and Mary Wheeler, to the front pews. Their faces were white as linen. With trembling hands, Samuel confessed to taking a neighbor's milk. In the hush that followed, Grant's eyes swept the congregation, daring anyone to look away. When he spoke, it was not in anger, but something worse, conviction. He told Samuel and Mary that their sin would bring rot down upon the whole community unless they repented, unless others too cast out their darkness. From that day forward, The world inside Willow Creek split down the middle. There were whispers of eyes behind curtains, footsteps in the dark, sudden disappearances. Some left offerings at the church steps, bread, eggs, a rabbit dressed and salted, hoping it would ward off Grant's scrutiny. Others avoided the preacher entirely, speaking his name only in frightened whispers, and all the while, Grant kept feeding his sermons with the private ugliness of his flock, fueling their dread, tightening his grip. He was a man with a taste for confession, a hunger for the darkness inside other souls. And each week, the line to his door grew longer, as fear devoured hope one trembling prayer at a time. But even as the town turned inward, as neighbors became strangers, and the darkness thickened, none could guess the secret that Abel Grant nursed in silence. None could know the reason he had come to Willow Creek, nor the hunger that burned beneath his calm, relentless eyes. The storm, they thought, had passed, but it was only just beginning. If you stood on the porch of the church in the pale light of July, you could see the whole of Willow Creek, laid out like a secret, confessed to the sky. Smoke drifted bitter and blue from cracked chimneys. The fields, blunt with stunted corn and shorn wheat, leaned back from the mountains as if even the land was drawing away. Half-wild dogs prowled the lanes. It was a place alive with eyes wary, measuring, afraid. Those eyes watched Abel Grant every Sunday, squinting up as his shadow swept the aisles, his voice digging down into their bones like rain in soft earth. It was not just the sermons that changed that summer. It was the way people carried themselves, shoulders hunched, words guarded. Even laughter grew brittle, the kind that broke too easily. The children who once splashed recklessly in the creek now played in whispers, casting nervous glances at the church as if it might swallow them whole. No one spoke of joy. They spoke of survival, of sin, and of the weight carried between their ribs. Grant had turned the parsonage into a fortress of silence. No lantern was ever seen burning past a certain hour, no visitor left with answers. Each evening, he studied his Bible beneath the single flicker of an oil lamp, its flame warped by the night wind rattling the loose window frames. Sometimes he walked among the graves behind the church, boots thick in mud, pausing before old stones as if seeking counsel from those who no longer had breath to disagree. Villagers wondered at his discipline, his unswerving routine, morning prayers before dawn, chores done with military precision, then the long, relentless devotion to curating each soul's private failings. On Wednesdays, he opened the church to anyone seeking guidance, but few found solace. Instead, there was a process. Confessions, he called them, silent and solemn. Grant would beckon each person down the cold wooden aisle, ask a single question, and let the silence fill the space. "What have you done?" The answers differed. A stolen egg, a wounding word, a hidden letter withheld from a loved one. Grant never softened. He listened as if siphoning something dark from the world, deeper than forgiveness could dig. Those who confessed felt lighter as they left, but also watched. The preacher missed nothing. Sins weighed both ways, on the world and on their souls. Word traveled beyond Willow Creek as the weeks crawled on. In neighboring hamlets, stories took seed, tales of a preacher who seemed to drink in the worst parts of people and asked for more. Some thought the church was plagued. Others believed Grant was a chosen man, carrying out God's judgment with hands too steady to doubt. Outsiders began to arrive, some desperate, others merely curious. Each left quieter than when they arrived, heads low, unable to look the townsfolk in the eye. Among those who watched Abel Grant most closely was Emma Walker, a schoolteacher living alone at the far end of town. Emma was neither pious nor faithless, but she bore tragedy quietly. A fiancé lost in the mines, a younger brother lost to fever. She kept careful notes in a diary, sketches of faces, things she overheard at the well, scraps of sermons that echoed too loudly in her mind. Emma sensed a shift, a tightening. People avoided her gaze, and sometimes she caught them praying for her from across the street. She saw the way fear settled along doorframes and lingered in the hush before a neighbor greeted another. She felt it in the air, thickening, coiling. In late July, a new scandal set Willow Creek ablaze. A storehouse had been ransacked in the night, sacks of flour gone, a ham stolen, shelves left in shambles. No one heard the thief, but someone whispered that a muddy footprint matched the boots of Peter Cobb, a youth who drank too much and worked too little. Before long, the rumor took on shape, grew teeth. Cobb, half-starved and desperate, denied everything, But his word meant little. The town was hungry, and hunger is a wicked judge. It was only a matter of time before Grant turned his gaze to him. That Sunday, the preacher's voice sculpted the air. Sin does not bloom in darkness. It blooms in silence, in the soil of cowardice. Who among us stands unafraid before the Lord's gaze? His eyes fixed on Cobb, and the youth flushed scarlet, squirming in his seat. No accusation was made, but none was needed. The congregation's discomfort radiated out like heat. After service, Emma saw Peter Cobb sitting alone behind the church, head in his hands. She hesitated, then approached. The creek gurgled nearby, and somewhere a mourning dove was calling. "It wasn't me," Peter said, voice raw. "They'll never believe it. Grant already knows who he wants to see fall." Emma nodded, weighing the words carefully. "People are scared. Fear makes easy villains." Peter looked up, his eyes shining. "What if I confessed to something I didn't do, just to end it? Would that save anyone?" Emma said nothing, but her silence seemed to answer for her. The way things were now, sacrifice and truth had drifted so far apart they barely recognized each other. Behind them, the sun dipped lower, and the church's long shadow spilled further across the grass, swallowing the graves, reaching for the creek. Storms returned in August, drenching the land, turning roads into rivers and fields into lakes of slick brown mud. Food grew scarcer, tempers shorter. The preacher's Sunday calls for public repentance became a ritual of dread, a parade of faces pale as rain, each compelled to unearth old shames before their neighbors. Grant compelled his flock with no visible anger, yet his insistence cut deeper than violence. Some nights the hum of prayer echoed down the lanes, a current of collective terror rippling through every home, touched by want and suspicion. Emma watched Grant begin to falter too. He appeared tired, more gaunt than ever, as if the weight of the town's fears was wearing him old in weeks. But his devotion did not waver. On nights she passed by the church, she saw his light alone burning into the small hours. From behind drawn curtains, she sometimes greeted his shadow cast against the window. A lone figure hunched over scripture, or perhaps over something darker yet. The town's breaking point arrived with the discovery of another theft, this time medicine from the apothecary. Tempers flared. Some accused the preacher of drawing so much attention to darkness that crimes multiplied simply to fill it. Others whispered that Grant himself kept a ledger of every sin, tallying them for some grim purpose no one dared guess. By mid-August, Willow Creek was nothing like the place it had been in spring. Once neighbors might have gathered for song or an evening meal. Now they crouched behind locked shutters, clutching what little they owned, eyeing each visitor as a threat. The only place where anyone still spoke out loud was in Grant's church, and each word spoken was heavy, dropped like a stone in a well. The preacher grew leaner, more remote, his sermons laced with warnings of rot, of final reckonings, of wolves among sheep. But in these warnings, Emma began to sense not just the voice of a man calling for purity, but that of a man wrestling demons he dare not name. As summer waned, hope in Willow Creek grew threadbare, and the air crackled with things left unsaid. Yet far beneath, past fear, past anger, something else simmered, an unvoiced question, passed from hand to hand silently. What did Abel Grant truly seek? And how much more could a town built on secrets endure before breaking? And so the shadows lengthened, and the story crept onward, toward a reckoning not even Grant could forestall. By early September, the mountains that bordered Willow Creek seemed higher, steeper, their ridges crowding in on the narrow spans of farmland and tired homes. The air grew thick with golden dust from the exhausted fields, and every night settled like a lid, leaving the town swaddled in anxious quiet. If faith was a shield, it was beginning to crack. The rituals that once brought comfort now felt like burdens, and hunger, both physical and spiritual, gnawed deeper. Reverend Abel Grant did not slow. Each Sunday brought new confessions, some real, some forced, all wrung out before the congregation like stains to be scrubbed clean. Grant's sermons echoed through the church rafters and out into the muddy lanes. Every heart is an echo of darkness. Who will be bold enough to reveal the shape of their shadows? Faces blurred with guilt, necks bowed low, Grant demanded truth not just as a balm but as a test. Outside the church, however, things began to unravel. The line between honest faith and mania grew blurrier. Rumors stole through the town like cold wind, catching in ears that hungered for answers. Some nights a few townsfolk gathered in secret, talking about leaving, starting over somewhere Grant's shadow could not follow. Others spoke of confronting the preacher, hoping to reach the man beneath the relentless voice. But nothing changed. The rituals continued. The stories grew darker. Emma Walker struggled with these changes most acutely. Teaching became almost impossible. The children withdrew, whispers thick between lessons, eyes darting to the windows whenever Grant strode past. Parents, once eager for their children to learn, now fretted about what words were swapped in the schoolyard, what secrets might spill into the preacher's hands. Emma watched the town fragment. Neighbors who spent lifetimes together now dodged each other's company. Some refused to attend church, but most still came, drawn out of fear rather than hope. The air within the sanctuary grew heavy, everyone acutely aware of what might be asked of them, how exposed they might become. Grant's requests for confession pressed harder, as though masked sin was a fever he needed to purge. Some felt relief when finally called to the front, if only to escape the dreadful anticipation. One stifling afternoon, Emma found herself walking along the creek bank, skirts heavy with the dust of the road. She carried a notebook, her only solace her attempts to bring order to the chaos. The water whispered of older times, before Grant, before the hunger, before the fear. She wondered how a single man's hunger for control could infect an entire town, how the desire to be made pure could corrode even the simplest kindness. As she drifted closer to the churchyard, Emma saw Job Carter. He knelt before his son's stones, brow furrowed, hands knotted against the humid air. Job was one of the few who never confessed. The town whispered about it, wondering what sins he hid inside his thick miner's frame. But Emma suspected something else. Job's pain was too large for words. "Are you afraid of him?" she asked, startling him from reverie. Job looked up, face creased and wary. "I have buried enough fear out here to last me 3 lives. Grant uses fear the way a blacksmith swings a hammer. He shapes souls that way, not me. Fear's an old companion." Emma studied him, thinking how many others had let fear become a stranger. "I wish people remembered who they were before they learned to be afraid." Job shook his head, eyes distant. "Maybe nobody remembers. Maybe that's the sin Grant wants us all to confess." September wore on. When dusk fell, windows lit with pale lamplight flickered and dimmed, and whole households seemed to fold inward, hugging their secrets and their small stores of food. Whispers fled through the gloom. Grant, some said, kept a record in a locked drawer, an index of every confession. Others claimed he met each night with his own reckoning, scrawling answers to sins he refused to name aloud. The air was thick with suspicion, especially as the weather began to turn, and failed crops promised a mean winter. Yet there was business to conduct and life to live. The county fair was scheduled for the last weekend in September, and though the mood was hesitant, the townsfolk clung to tradition. The fair was held on battered green across from Cobb's store, a place where children were once free to run, where pies cooled on wooden tables and music crept up from the valley. This year, the fair was subdued. Booths were poorly stocked, laughter was thin and uncertain. Still, for one day, Willow Creek tried to remember joy. Emma walked the rows, watching mothers trade preserves, noticing the way the preacher moved between the crowds, never fully part of them, but always watching. Grant accepted greetings but offered none in return. The children shrank from his gaze, spilling back behind skirts and barrels. It was then, amid the churn of fairgoers and the faint plucking of a fiddle, that a sudden commotion broke out. Mary Wheeler had collapsed, clutching her chest, face slick with cold sweat. The crowd gathered, murmuring, as Samuel knelt over her, frantic. Grant pushed forward, voice steady as thunder. "Help her in the name of the Lord. Only truth can heal." Some interpreted his words as a call for prayer, others as accusation. Samuel sobbed, insisting he had confessed everything he'd ever done. Others looked away, ashamed to watch more suffering. Mary was carried to the apothecary, lingered for days on the edge of death, recovering only slowly. Afterward, Emma heard something she never expected. A group of parents gathered late in her classroom, speaking openly about Grant. They discussed how the preacher's presence seemed to make the pain sharper, not merely exposing weaknesses, but deepening them. "We used to be a town," one father said, voice trembling. "Now it's like we're each an island, waiting for the tide to come in and wash us away." Emma felt a flicker of resolve. She began searching for anyone who might know more about Grant, his past, his true reasons for coming to Willow Creek. She sent letters, talked with shopkeepers in neighboring towns, traced rumors like threads through fading memories. Bits and pieces returned. A grief-stricken preacher who arrived alone, always carrying a lockbox and a battered Bible. Some spoke of tragedy, others of a calling. Not a single person ever described him as kind. One evening, as harvest failed again and the first frost threatened, the townsfolk gathered for another service. Grant's sermon was long, richer with menace, his voice carrying over the pews like a dirge. Sin multiplies when allowed to flourish unspoken. You have not said enough. Emma felt the air tense with every word. She watched as Grant's eyes scanned the room, not for answers but for weaknesses. After service, many left without speaking. Some wept. The town felt newly frayed, a net stretched so tight it was bound to tear. That night, lightning shattered over the fields. The creek flooded, soaking the last of the crops. Emma, staring at the bleak lines on her notebook, wondered what terrible secret kept Grant so invested in their suffering. Far out in the gloom, the church steeple stabbed up into the night, its single bell silent, the parsonage windows burning with lonely candlelight. Somewhere inside, Abel Grant prepared for another confession, another night spent mining souls. And outside, Willow Creek waited, afraid, weary, and ready, perhaps, to learn the truth lurking beneath the preacher's relentless hunger. October arrived in Willow Creek with its chill, the first hard frost scarring the grass, and thin ice haunting the creek's edges by dawn. The land withdrew into itself. Even the air seemed brittle, every sound sharp. Footsteps on frozen ground, the wind through empty branches, the bell atop the church struck by gusts but no longer by hand. Leaves clung brown and lifeless to the trees, matching the way the people of Willow Creek clung to old routines, staving off change for a few more days. But it was clear that the town was reaching a breaking point, and the cracks were now impossible to hide. It began with another disappearance, this time a child. Elsie Hobbs, 8 years old, last seen near the edge of the woods gathering sticks for the cook stove after dusk. Her mother's screams carried in the cold evening, and before sunrise half the town was searching by lantern light, combing through brush and river reeds, calling her name. The search dragged on with no result. Old suspicions, half buried for months, erupted in tense flares. Had someone seen her the night before? Had she run away or been taken? Faces blanched, eyes scanned the crowd for any sign of guilt. Reverend Grant offered prayers at sunrise, but few listened. He spoke of the wages of unrepented sin, of consequences lashing out where darkness was left to fester. The Lord sees all, he declared, standing in the raw wind that stung the knuckles and numbed the lips. But his certainty no longer comforted. It only stoked a simmering anger. The days following Elsie's disappearance settled into a feverish rhythm. People moved in small clusters, speaking quietly. Even chores took longer. Each neighbor expected to account for his time and whereabouts, each word weighed for hidden meaning. The school closed. Emma Walker spent her days comforting Elsie's grieving mother, tangled in her own knots of fear and resentment. It wasn't just the girl's absence. There had been too many losses. Crops, livestock, laughter, hope. Each one felt like a sign, and everywhere eyes turned to the church for answers. Or a target. The unspoken pact Grant had forged, the agreement that pain could be cleansed by confession, had infected the air. But now pain had become the town's only crop, and Grant's hunger for repentance had become insatiable. On the third day, a meeting was called in the cramped back room of Cobb's store. It was the first public gathering, not presided over by Grant in nearly a year. Lamps wept pale light on drawn faces. Emma was there, sitting between Job Carter and Samuel Wheeler. There were no hymns, no prayers, only the desperate hush of people who had run out of answers. He feeds on this, Job muttered, voice raw. Every week something more is asked. Every secret squeezed dry. I've given all I can and still he wants more. He's not responsible for a child missing, another argued, but the protest died quickly. Emma spoke quietly. Maybe not responsible, but he has changed us. We look at each other as enemies. We see nothing but sin everywhere we turn. That is not how this town was built. The storekeeper, Mr. Cobb, shifted on his stool. So what do we do? Run him out? Fight him? Our faith was all we had. There was silence, a long absence of hope, as if the town itself was pausing for a sign. Outside, the wind howled, and in the flickering lamplight, each face was cut with worry and exhaustion. For the first time, Grant's name was spoken with anger and fear in equal measure. The next evening, a procession lit only by lanterns wound toward the church, townsfolk gathering outside the locked doors. Grant, alerted by the noise, opened the doors carefully. Never before had he faced his flock in a throng, in the bitter open dark. Emma stepped forward, pulse in her throat. "We want to speak, all of us. Not just to you. To each other. The secrets you demanded. Maybe it's time we shared them ourselves together." Grant's voice, when it came, was softer than usual, but more dangerous for it. "It is not safe to release darkness among so many. A wound needs to be cleansed, alone in trust." Samuel Wheeler, gaunt and exhausted, shook his head. "Each week you have taken from us. Our peace, our privacy, our hope. We are empty, Reverend. If you want confession, you can hear it now from all of us. No more secrets." Someone in the back wept, and the sound caught in the choir of strangers' voices. From the crowd, stories tumbled out. Not just sins, but grief. Envy over lost crops, anger at a harsh father, sorrow for miscarried children, frustration with the endless grind of want. What began in whispers grew to a ragged chorus. A list of human frailties laid bare not for condemnation, but for understanding. Grant watched, silent for the first time since his arrival. He appeared shrunken in that moment, his posture uncertain, his authority siphoned away by the raw flood of human pain he had presumed to harness. The people weren't looking for purity. They hungered for connection, for forgiveness among themselves, not from a distant, angry God delivered through a single unbending mouthpiece. Emma felt a strange peace as she spoke aloud the things she had carried: fear for her students, her own heartbreak, resentment for the cold narrowness that had settled over the town. Facing her neighbors, she found herself less afraid. Of them, of Grant, of what darkness might reveal. Those confessions did not weaken Willow Creek. Instead, they bound the people together, fragile but united outside the preacher's gaze. When the last voice stilled, Abel Grant stepped down from the church steps, cloak heavy on his shoulders. He did not speak, but his eyes scanned the crowd, judging, perhaps, or understanding, or simply defeated by the truth of what he saw. That the greatest power in Willow Creek was not fear, but the shared suffering of its people. The night stretched on. Lanterns burned low, and chilly wind curled through the crowd. Grant slipped back inside the church, locking the door. No one followed. In the days that followed, something shifted in Willow Creek. The church stood quieter, humbler, its doors no longer closed, but not as crowded as before. Some people returned to old routines, gathering fallen wood, sharing food, mending fences together. Not everyone trusted the calm, but enough had learned that confession shared with equals brought a warmth long absent from the air. Emma walked the creek each dawn, watching as the mist lifted in slow ribbons. She heard laughter, thin but growing, from passing homes. Even the crows on the fence posts seemed less menacing. Still, there was an unspoken question hovering over Willow Creek. Where had Abel Grant come from? And more importantly, why? The preacher, for his part, kept to himself, withdrawing deeper into the parsonage. His hunger for now appeared sated, but the reasons for it, the pain that drove him, remained locked away. And the townsfolk, scarred but healing, wondered what would happen when their own shadows returned. The town did not forget Elsie Hobbs. Searchers combed the woods for weeks, but the girl was never found. Her absence left a hollowness that confession could not fill, a reminder of innocence lost somewhere beyond the reach of sermons, rituals, or faith. Yet it also left a resolve. No single voice would again demand the suffering of so many. As autumn deepened, Willow Creek prepared for another winter, hard, hungry, but theirs alone. Their story, carried on the mountain winds, was no longer one of fear or shame, but of survival. And behind it all, in the shuttered parsonage, the preacher who had fed them sin grew quieter, his legend no longer the only story that mattered. The first heavy snow arrived in November, blanketing the battered earth and softening the scars that had marked Willow Creek for months. Under the hush of white, the rhythms of daily survival took on new urgency. Woodpiles shrank, root cellars gave up their last potatoes and turnips, and night stretched longer with cold. With the church quieter than ever, and Reverend Grant a spectral presence at best, the people of Willow Creek turned inward, finding what comfort they could in the routines of winter. Gone was the preacher's insistent demand for public reckoning. Though the church doors still opened every Sunday, the crowds were thinner, the rituals subdued. Grant spoke less, his sermons pared down to scripture, stripped of accusation. He wore the same black coat but no longer paced. Instead, he sat behind the pulpit, watching his flock with a fatigue that bordered on resignation. For the first time, some found themselves pitying him. Emma Walker resumed the schoolroom in fits and starts. The children's eyes lingered on the windows, scanning for the first stirrings of spring, but their laughter was a little louder each passing week. Emma encouraged them to draw, to tell stories, to remember life as it was before fear had ruled the shape of every day. They drew pictures of farms and families, not darkness or sermons, and some even dared sketches of Willow Creek itself, thin lines for fences, thick ones for the mountains, and always a bright sun overhead. Even in winter, sometimes in the shadowed afternoons, Emma would pass the parsonage and see Abel Grant through the window. He moved slowly, carefully, as if his body was made of brittle glass. He spent hours at a desk, pen moving across sheets of paper. Occasionally he would leave the house and walk to the far edge of the graveyard, standing motionless for long stretches, staring at the horizon where the hills met sky. If anyone called to him, he would nod in acknowledgement, though he rarely exchanged words. The town itself began to mend. Simple things, sharing firewood, mending a broken fence, dipping into the last preserves, became gestures of solidarity. Slowly, trust, though not as bright or naive as before, had begun to seed itself in the cracks left by loss and suspicion. The wounds were not forgotten, but in the cold months shared struggle stitched the people back together with stronger, if less visible, thread. When Christmas came, it was quieter than ever before. No one expected Grant to lead carols or offer a blessing. Instead, the townsfolk gathered in Emma's schoolhouse for a meal cobbled from what remained. Stew, a loaf of bread, the smallest store of apples. Someone played a tune on a battered harmonica. There were tears for the lost, but laughter too. It was enough. Emma rose to speak. We have lost much this year, but we are not lost. We belong to each other more than to any dark memory. We are Willow Creek because of what we have survived together, not because of what was taken from us. The room grew still, words drifting over children and mothers, farmers and their wives, the old and nearly broken. The teacher's voice warmed the timber beams and lingered there long after, sharper and more real than any sermon. Outside, the snow muffled the world. The church on the hill was dark. As the days passed, the distance between the town and the preacher narrowed by necessity. A sickness swept through Willow Creek, winter's common enemy. Children developed fevers. Elders labored for breath. Old habits, suspicion, self-preservation rose briefly, but were set aside as neighbors tended to each other. Emma, with teaching skills and calm, took on the role of nurse. Even Samuel Wheeler, always thin and anxious, appeared at homes to chop wood, mend blankets, and fetch water. One bitter afternoon, a knock came at Emma's door. Abel Grant stood on the threshold, hat in hand, shoulders stooped. I heard the baker boy is feverish, he said quietly. Emma nodded, wary. Yes, we're doing what we can. Grant looked down, voice muffled. If you'll have me, I would help. There are medicines still in the parsonage. I know some remedies. Emma considered him for a long moment, seeing not the moral judge or the distant pastor, but a man carved down, whittled by his own choices, his burdens made visible. Come in, Reverend, she said. Grant helped. He moved from house to house, tending the sick, speaking little, working slowly and with care. Sometimes Emma watched him pause beside a bedside, lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps apology. The town did not trust him easily, but they accepted his help. In that bleak season, need outweighed anger. The months wore on, and so did the cold. February thawed only briefly before more snow closed in. Now voices no longer hid behind confessions. People spoke directly, remembering together instead of only repenting separately. The Wheeler baby survived, the baker boy's cough faded, and old Mrs. Cobb lived to see the tips of daffodil bulbs poke through the melting snow. Throughout it all, Grant continued his simple duties. He mended steps on the church, fetched water for the elderly, and hammered out cracked window panes. His presence was quiet, unremarkable, his hunger for confession now replaced by something gentler. If he grieved, He did so alone behind the thin walls of the parsonage, his pain private at last. Emma found herself thinking often of forgiveness, not only for the preacher, but for the town itself. She saw how easily goodness could be twisted by pain, how quickly hope could sour into fear, and how sometimes the courage to begin again required more than faith. It required the grace to face someone's brokenness, and your own, and choose mercy even in the bleakest months. By March, the creek ran higher, swollen with melting snow, and children risked splashing through icy shallows on the first warm afternoon. The mountain air turned gentle, the wind less cruel, and in that fragile returning light, Willow Creek began to heal in earnest. Some wounds never truly faded, but in the slow rebuilding, something new and resilient took root. The legend of Reverend Abel Grant would linger, to be sure, the preacher who once fed on their darkest secrets. But as the world thawed, it was no longer only a story of fear and hunger. It was a story of survival, and of people who, for all they had lost, managed, finally, to choose one another over their own divisions. And as the final frost melted, the town looked once more to the church on the hill, not as the seat of its terror, but simply as a place where they could come together, flawed and whole, to begin again. As spring uncoiled from the frost, Willow Creek changed in small, insistent ways. Cold mud gave way to green shoots. The battered town found itself breathing a little easier, limbs stretching after months hunched in on themselves. Plows scuffed the fields, and children's laughter rebounded along the creek again. Yet with each sign of new life, the memory of what had come before remained. A shadow beneath the sunlight, an ache beneath fresh hope. With the ground softening, the social fabric stitched during winter held. Men and women who once called on Reverend Grant to solve their quarrels now sought each other. Arguments were settled over shared labor, misunderstandings melted by time and effort. When a horse pitched lame for want of shoeing or piglets went missing to foxes, the town fixed the problem together, gradually remembering how to trust, how to lean on one another. Through it, Abel Grant was ever present yet peripheral. No longer the force that compelled their voices or demanded their secrets, he became another townsperson, mending fences, tending to the sick, sweeping the worn steps of the church. People spoke to him with politeness, even brief warmth. But the easy awe and terror he once commanded had evaporated. Grant responded with humility, his presence subdued. His role now that of a man attempting to repair what he could, quietly carrying the weight no words would lessen. Emma Walker, for her part, watched the preacher with a clear, discerning heart. She saw a man wounded by his own deeds, changed by the community that resisted being devoured by shame. Though she wondered at the secrets lurking beneath his quietness, she felt no urge to unearth them. Some wounds, she knew, must heal from within, without the harsh light of public reckoning. One mild afternoon, Emma found Abel Grant walking along the creek, his gaze fixed on swollen banks. She approached, the silence between them companionable. "Spring's late," Emma observed, watching moss and grass emerge along the muddy bank. Grant nodded. "It is," he answered. "But it always comes, no matter what's buried beneath the snow." Emma regarded him. "You're not leaving." He looked at her, and she saw the fatigue etched around his eyes give way for just a moment to gratitude. "Where would I go, Miss Walker? This place knows my failings. Most others would only guess them." She nodded in understanding. They stood a while watching sunlight dance along the surface of the creek. Grant finally spoke again, almost to himself. "Sometimes I worry it's not what I did, but what I made others confess. That will haunt Willow Creek the longest." Emma laid a hand on his sleeve, steady and sure. "What haunts us is what we carry alone. This town will choose for itself what it keeps and what it forgives. The chores and obligations of the season multiplied with the sun. Fences needed repair from long months beaten by wind. Water barrels and wells were checked, barns re-roofed, fields cleared of debris. In every task, the townsfolk discovered echoes of their old selves, enduring, inventive and quietly compassionate. One Sunday, Samuel Wheeler, no longer gaunt but carrying new lines of worry on his face, stood at the front of the church and offered thanks, not just to God, but to the neighbors who helped him through winter's famine and his wife's illness. His voice steadied as he spoke. "We cannot know the darkness waiting in each new season, but we know now it must be faced together, not in fear of one another, but in need." Heads nodded around the room. Even Job Carter, never inclined to public words, grunted his agreement and brought forth loaves of his wife's bread for all to share after service. The ritual had shifted, not a parade of guilt, but a celebration of the weakest thread, the capacity to begin again. Reverend Grant delivered his sermons softly, rarely straying from Scripture, sometimes speaking of the comfort found in wrestling with doubt rather than hiding from it. He encouraged forgiveness, not through punishment but as a form of mutual rescue. When he prayed with the congregation, there was no fire in his voice, only gentleness, a man learning, perhaps too late, that faith could be a refuge, not a weapon. Emma documented the changes in her notebook. The names of the children who returned to school, faces revived with color, laughter restored. The lists of neighbors visiting the sick, the impromptu gatherings at the riverbank, nets mended by many hands. She made note of the silences, too, conversations never finished, tensions unresolved, grief that had not faded. She saw that healing did not mean forgetting, but she sensed in every shared chore a new story told, the real legend of Willow Creek being rewritten in small, hard-earned acts of grace. Later that spring, a letter arrived for Grant, a thick parcel marked by a hand from Charleston. Old news, perhaps a summons or a plea from family left behind. He did not share its contents, but afterward he seemed quieter still, sometimes lingering by the graves behind the church, lips moving in silent conversation with those long departed. Emma wondered if he was saying goodbye or asking forgiveness, and whether it mattered. The preacher who had once divided Willow Creek was now simply part of its tapestry, a caution, a lesson, a reminder that no one lives above the need for mercy. As days grew long and warm, rumors drifted into Willow Creek from neighboring towns. Stories of disaster, towns broken by quarrels over land and fear, families uprooted after failed harvests or sudden violence. But Willow Creek held. No one saw themselves as exempt from trouble any longer, not merely through the pain visited on them by hunger or loss, but through survival hard-won in the crucible of each other's eyes. The legend of Abel Grant was no longer a tale of horror, but of reckoning, a warning passed from parent to child about the danger of isolation, the cost of silent suffering, and the redemptive power of shared truth. One cool dusk, as frogs sang in the fields and lamps flickered on, Emma sat with a handful of old neighbors on the schoolhouse steps. They spoke softly of those lost and those who had returned, and the way that for all its darkness, the past year had taught them the real meaning of sanctuary. We survived him. And the worst of ourselves, said one mother, stroking her toddler's hair. And if trouble comes again, another asked quietly. Emma met Grant's gaze across the circle, his posture easy in the fading light. We do what we did. We face it together. That's all any of us can do. That night, as the town drifted into sleep, a sense of peace, fragile perhaps, but earned, settled over Willow Creek. The preacher's hunger had once threatened to consume them all. Instead, what remained now was the bond made by weathering his storm, and the promise that no one need carry their darkness alone again. Summer deepened, painting Willow Creek in warm gold and rich green, bringing a beauty that had not been seen since before the shadow of Abel Grant. The creek sparkled as it wound its way through the heart of town, fields swayed under cautious optimism, and the rhythm of life grew strong again. There were still scars, memories of hunger, distrust and the cold, tyranny of confession, but they were softened, now by shared labor and the unspoken promise that the hardest lessons would not be lost. Reverend Grant moved among the town with a sense of purpose that belonged to someone in search of atonement. He worked the fields beside Job Carter, repairing fence posts and sharing silent hours. He fetched water for old Mrs. Cobb, listened patiently as she recounted years of loss and endurance. He brought medicine to the Backer family, tended their gardens with care. When trouble arose, Grant helped resolve disputes by listening, not judging. His sermons, when given, were humble and short, rarely more than a reflection on a single line of scripture. Sometimes he spoke of mercy, sometimes of the burden of leadership, more often of the quiet courage to face one's failings in the presence of those they may have harmed. He did not seek forgiveness outright from the town, but each small act was a step toward healing what could be healed. Emma watched this slow transformation with a heart both heavy and hopeful. She saw the old preacher, no longer an object of fear or awe, learning to belong by service rather than authority. She observed the townsfolk, who responded cautiously at first, but grew warmer as Grant's actions spoke louder than any penance he might offer. There were those who never forgot, who never truly forgave. Samuel Wheeler still avoided Grant, and Mary Wheeler's eyes held a sadness that had settled in deep. But most had moved forward, determined not to allow old wounds to define every day. One particular afternoon, Emma gathered with neighbors at the church to wash windows, rake leaves, and polish pews. Most worked quietly, but as the day wore on, laughter rose and stories were exchanged, the kind that mended old breaks rather than deepened them. Abel Grant joined them, rolling up his sleeves, methodically scrubbing away the grime of a year weighed down by sorrow. During a break, Emma found Grant sitting alone by the steps. She joined him, handing him a mug of cold cider. "Why stay?" she asked gently. "You could have left and no one would have blamed you." Grant looked at her, his eyes clearer than they had been in months. "If I left, I would remain the villain in every story ever told about this town. If I stay, perhaps I become something else, not forgettable maybe, and not forgiven entirely, but part of the place as it truly is." Emma nodded. "You do not occupy our shadows anymore. Now you work in the sun beside us." He smiled, slow, rueful. "I think that is all anyone could ever want." As the season turned, a letter arrived for Grant from Charleston. It was an invitation, written in elegant script, asking him to serve a larger parish with better pay and greater prestige. Emma learned of this through Mrs. Cobb, who relished every scrap of news, passing word in whispers beneath the window-sills. Grant did not answer the letter for several weeks. He wrestled with the decision in private, seeking counsel from no one. The townsfolk speculated over the matter, some believing he would leave, others certain he would remain, quietly living out his exile among the very people he had once divided. Late in August, Grant addressed the congregation after Sunday service. "I have been asked to move on," he said simply, "but my debt to Willow Creek is not yet paid. I choose to stay, not as your judge, not as your savior, but as one more among you, bound by what we share, responsible for what I helped break." A murmur swept through the crowd, relief for some, disappointment for a few, respect for many. Emma watched the moment land with a quiet satisfaction. By choosing to remain, Grant accepted the full weight of his story, not escaping its consequences but embracing the hard work of daily repair. That decision marked a subtle but lasting shift. Willow Creek shed its old ghosts gradually but surely. The crops thrived as summer waned, and preparations for the harvest fair began with more enthusiasm than the year before. Children devised games, fathers built simple rides out of lumber and rope, mothers baked pies with the first apples and berries. Emma threw herself into organizing activities, rallying neighbors, teaching children songs for the fair. Grant volunteered, offering a gentle hand but never insisting on more than was welcome. During the celebrations, he stood among the crowd rather than above it, laughing at jokes, sharing a plate of stew, applauding the children's performances with genuine pride. For the first time in a year, the church was filled not with dread or judgment, but with warmth, a sense of belonging earned through trial, forgiveness and persistent quiet atonement. One night, as the first hints of autumn breeze drifted through open windows, Emma sat with Grant on the church's steps. They listened to the distant fiddles from the fairground, watched the stars scatter above the town. "Do you fear being forgotten?" Emma asked. Grant considered the question. "No. I fear being remembered only for my worst mistakes. But I know now that stories change in the retelling." She regarded him with gentle candor. "We have all been hurt. We have hurt others. That isn't the end. Each season starts again and we choose what to bring with us." He glanced at her, his gratitude unspoken but understood. "I pray that is true." In the quiet that followed, the truth of Willow Creek's recovery was plain. There were still troubles ahead, but no one man would ever own the story again. Their legend grew richer, marked by shame, yes, but also by the resilience to overcome it, with generosity, kindness, and a commitment to face darkness together. As the summer faded and new leaves began to blush with the promise of another winter, the townsfolk prepared once again, not for another reckoning, but for the routine cycles of life. Fields, schools, celebrations, laughter in abundance and sorrow when needed. Grant's shadow receded, and the memory of his hunger was softened into the greater story of their survival. And so, the preacher who once fed them sin had become simply Abel Grant, a man among many changed by his own failures, changed further still by the town that chose to forgive, rebuild, and remember together. When the final harvest moon rose orange and round over Willow Creek, a hush settled on the town, a silence born not of fear, but of awe for what had been survived. The air grew sweet and cold, cicadas fading away, replaced by the slow pulse of crickets and the crackling of hearth fires. The last sheaves of grain had been gathered, the orchards cleared, and preparation for winter began with confidence, not desperation. The church stood on the hill, like always, but now its windows glowed with the soft light of community rather than the stark radiance of indictment. It hosted gatherings, meals, meetings, quiet moments of song. The townsfolk no longer entered with heads bowed, but with arms linked, voices ready to linger in conversation even after the candles burned low. Abel Grant remained, as promised, a presence among his neighbors and their routines. Sometimes he led prayers for the sick, sometimes he worked at the sawmill or lent his hands to planting bulbs along the church path. Every task completed was a quiet act of atonement. Each word exchanged another stitch in the fabric that bound him to the people he had once unsettled. Emma Walker watched the story of Willow Creek settle into something new, no longer marked by the hunger for confession, but by the collective wisdom born of shared struggle. She continued her work at the schoolhouse, teaching children both the scripts and sums required for life, and the less tangible lessons whispered in the creak of the classroom floor, the hush of the woods. She taught, by example and story, that every community contains darkness, but it is in honest reckoning, not repression, that light always returns. Occasionally travelers passed through town, asking in lowered voices about the preacher of Willow Creek. They expected to find a terrifying figure, or at least a ghost of old authority. Instead, they found a man in a worn coat, stacking firewood, greeting his neighbors by name. The rumors they'd heard seemed to dissolve in the easy warmth of the square, the friendly laughter spilling from the schoolhouse window. Some left puzzled, a few stayed on, drawn by the promise that in this place the shadows had been faced, and if not banished, lovingly woven into the story's edges. The children of Willow Creek, weary for so long, learned to play again with true abandon. They raced through the gold grass, built forts of sticks and stone along the creek, retold the legend in games, the once dreaded preacher now a character as familiar as the fields and sky. They grew up in the new Willow Creek, where secrets were admitted, not weaponized, and sorrow drew neighbors in rather than pushing them out. With winter on the horizon, a sense of closure and hope pervaded the town. During the first snow, Emma organized a feast at the church, a celebration not of bounty, which was modest, but of endurance and togetherness. Long tables were set up, groaning with bread, roasted root vegetables, and bowls of stewed apples. The air bristled with the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke. Abel Grant attended, of course, taking a seat not at the head, but between Job Carter and Samuel Wheeler. Over food and laughter, stories were told, of the year's storms, the return of wandering sons, moments of loss and triumph. Each tale found its echo in the eyes of the listeners, an affirmation that joy and pain could be endured and shared. At the meal's end, Emma rose to speak. Her words, clear and kind, joined the hush of snowfall outside. We gather for more than food. We celebrate what could have broken us, but instead made us whole. We learned, sometimes painfully, how to reach for each other across distance and difference. Our legend is no longer just one of darkness, but of the living. Her gaze met Grant's, and in that silent acknowledgement, peace passed between preacher and teacher, between the one who had stirred the storm and the one who steadied its aftermath. In the following days, small rituals grew. Neighbors exchanged gifts without ceremony, a length of homespun cloth, a jar of preserved peaches, a new pair of mittens for a child. The routines of hard weather resumed with cooperation at the center. Each fence mended, road cleared, and meal shared became an act of trust renewed. Abel Grant's hair whitened at the temples. He aged alongside the town, no longer marked by the sharp edges of guilt, but softened by contentment and gentle regret. Emma, too, found herself more rooted in the rhythms of Willow Creek, her days no longer marred by fear for her students, but filled with hope for what they might remember and become. As the years wore on, the legend shifted, told at gatherings, passed in laughter and sometimes with gentle teasing among those who had endured its hard lessons. Children knew the tale. How a preacher once came urging confession of all secrets, how the town nearly tore itself apart, and how through hardship it discovered mercy, unity, and the promise never again to be ruled by a single voice. The gravestones behind the church weathered slowly. New faces arrived, some old ones departed, yet the heart of Willow Creek beat on, stronger, slower, wiser. Every spring, each family planted a row of sunflowers along the church fence, a sign that every memory, painful or sweet, held the seed of something bright. In the quiet last days before the turn of the century, Emma sat with Grant on the porch of the parsonage, watching light fade over the fields. The sky was streaked with crimson, the air rich with history, possibility. "We've come far, haven't we?" Emma murmured, her voice wavering between sorrow and gratitude. Grant nodded, his gaze resting on the village below. "Further than I deserved. I am grateful for every step. You made amends." "We all did," Grant replied. "We make them every day." For a long time neither spoke, content to let silence stand between them, as testament to wounds healed and journeys yet unfinished. When dusk finally swallowed the rest of the light, Emma stood to leave, her heart full. "Good night, Abel." "Good night, Emma. Go well into tomorrow." In West Virginia, stories are passed not through memory alone, but through the changing light, the shape of hills under snow, the laughter and the hush that settle over a town at peace. So it is in Willow Creek. Their legend, no longer horrifying but human, endures not in sermons or secrets, but in the shared lives of those who learned at last how to forgive, and thus the tale of Reverend Abel Grant, preacher, penitent, neighbor, was no longer a warning but proof that even the darkest hunger can yield to the bonds that make a community whole. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.